Professor Aurelian Craiutu was born and raised in Romania and came as a young adult to study in America, to study political ideas especially. He studied at Rutgers University and at Princeton University and taught a bit at Duke University before taking his present position at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. His publications include Liberalism Under Siege, The Political Thought of the French Doctrinaire, also Tocqueville on America After 1840, America Through European Eyes, which is a book that has been very useful to Professor Scott Sprenger and I in our class on European views of America. He has also edited the political works of François Guizot and Madame de Staël, two very important French thinkers who are not well enough known, but he is helping to make them better known. He has a brand new book. I think really it's still practically warm off the press here. This book is called A Virtue for Courageous Minds, Moderation in French Political Thought, 1748 to 1830. When we think of French political thought, we might think of boldness, radicalism, liberty, equality, fraternity, the sovereignty of the people, the general will, Rousseau, and so forth. We don't often think of moderation, but we ought to. And this is a somewhat forgotten tradition that goes back to one of the greatest political philosophers in the Western canon, that is Montesquieu, in the earlier part of the 18th century. But it continues on through the French Revolution and into the 19th century. And Tocqueville is certainly for Americans, the most famous representative of this current in French thought. And Professor Craiutu is a leading contributor to an effort to bring into the light in our times moderate French political thinkers, French in a tradition called the liberal tradition in European thought. And he's doing some excellent work that helps us to see how we might learn more about a certain tradition of political moderation from these French thinkers. And today, Professor Craiutu is going to help us see how America looks from the eyes of this French moderate or liberal tradition, including Tocqueville and some very important but to us lesser known thinkers. So thanks again for coming, and please join me in welcoming Professor Aurelian Craiutu. We're still waiting on handouts. These Ivana.
Yeah, the handouts that were distributed.
We'll send.
Yeah, there's another one coming. Yeah.
Send one assistant to find the other, and then if that doesn't work,
I'll make references to this one. Yeah. Thank you for taking time to be with us this afternoon. I understand the competition is almost unbeatable, great weather, great scenery, and here we are talking about French issues. So I'll try to be speaking with a Hoosier accent so that I can entertain you even more. And since we are in the March Madness time, I said this all over throughout the day. I have no responsibility for Indiana being ranked the 4th in the Southwest Division, but if it's the 4th, I think Go Hoosiers would be an appropriate thing to say. So I hope that you'll cheer for my home team, and I'll cheer for yours, okay?
we have to look and see if by some miracle the Cougars advance, how far we'd have to go to meet Indiana. Maybe in the finals.
Maybe in the finals, but if something happens, and if tomorrow I manage to win at tennis against Professor Hancock, which is the main reason of my visit here, then we can talk about a second stage of competition here. The topic that we have for today is both an academic but also a political and intellectually stimulating one. Because I know that you've traveled around the world, or you'll be traveling around the world, and you'll get to encounter a lot of cliches, platitudes, commonplaces about America. You are Americans. You are going to come into contact with Europeans and others, but in this case, Europeans, and you'll figure out that it's very difficult to make sense of what they think of America at times. And there are reasons for that. Ever since its discovery by the Europeans, America has captivated the imaginations of people around the world as a geographic space and a site of human possibility. As the United States emerged as a major political actor on the world scene, Europeans often saw in America more than America. And this is something that has to be said from the very beginning. As the most famous traveler to this country, Alexis de Tocqueville, the Frenchman, put it, and this is the first quote on the handout that I circulated, I did not go to America to satisfy my curiosity, however legitimate. I sought there lessons from which we might profit. I admit I saw in America more than America. It was the shape of democracy itself which I sought, its inclinations, character, prejudices, and passion. I wanted to understand it so as at least to know what we have to fear or hope therefrom. It's a beautiful quote taken from the introduction to Volume 1 of Democracy in America, and it's a one that shows that in all of the accounts that we will examine about America, Europeans most likely saw in America much more than America. They might have seen their own hopes and fears about how to improve their own world, as well as their curiosity at work about this new country. During the past 2.5 centuries, admirers and critics alike have put forward an amazingly diverse array of interpretations. In France, in particular, from celebrations of America as a land of freedom and a city upon a hill, to accusations of America as a police state that condones deep-seated injustices and plays the role of an arrogant imperial power. And this is, I think, precisely why it is both timely and important to study the origins and the evolution of the image of America in the eyes of European travelers, French in particular, but also others. By revisiting some classic accounts of American society, we can shed some light on the genealogy and coherence of current controversies about America. We may also be able to understand some roots of anti-Americanism around the world, in particular France. And by looking at the range of accounts offered by travelers to America, we may come to the conclusion in the end that each of them discovered, so to speak, their own personal Americas, filtered through their pre-existing conceptual lenses. For most of them, as you'll see, America was a starting point of their reflections, or to put it differently, a bridge between what they saw in Europe and what they aspired to change there. So sometimes, in order to understand what they had to say about America, we need to remember that they were interested in changing things at home. So America was a bridge between the state of affairs there and the projected or the desired state of affairs there through their own desires. Since we all know Tocqueville rather well these days, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with, at least with his name, he has been quoted by all U.S. presidents since Eisenhower, including George W. Bush, I should say this. I would like to surprise you a little by introducing a few names that you may have not heard of, that will be probably familiar with most of you, but some nonetheless important ones. Tocqueville, who spent 9 months in America from May 1831 to February 1832, was not the first French person to write about the nature of American democracy. Before he came to be seen as a political model for 19th century Europe, I have 2 names in French history that are salient for our topic. One is Crèvecoeur, and the other one is Lafayette. Crèvecoeur was a French who actually came to settle in America, and he bought a farm in the eastern part of the country. And he eventually resettled back to France, but he wrote a famous book called Letters from an American Farmer. And of course, we have the General Lafayette, who epitomizes the love story of Americans with France. Lafayette came here, fought for the independence, and went back as a hero. America was acquired towards the end of the 18th century the image of a mythic country, unspoiled by luxury, very close to nature, a land where the main occupation was agriculture and where people lived peacefully in austerity and virtuous simplicity. Crèvecoeur's letters in particular published in the Letters from an American Farmer, described this mode of farming, the manners, the peculiar customs of the Americans. And this work, published in 1780s, contributed greatly to the dissemination, 1782, published greatly to the dissemination of this pastoral and in many ways idyllic image of an American Arcadia. As such, America appeared as a boundless and a bountiful continent, a virgin environment, and a territory of adventure and discovery that inspired the travelers and nourished their imagination. Eventually, however, this ideal came to be replaced by the image of a country whose economic life was in constant transformation, a society bent on indefinite progress and innovation, constant change. Individuals were no longer seen as deriving their happiness from living a frugal life, as it was in accounts in a previous period, especially in Letters from an American Farmer. On the contrary, their happiness was now related to rising living material standards, comfort and material prosperity, resulting from an ever-expanding commerce and navigation. Over time, within a period of a couple of decades actually, America came to be regarded as a hallmark of utilitarianism and materialism, a country in which everything and everyone was on the move and in constant search for ways of improving the conditions of daily life. So it is worth noting at the same time that this dynamic face of America as a constant, the locus of constant change was seen as an outcome of its democratic institutions. So there was a link between the way of life in America and its democratic institutions that was seized upon by these observers early on. But the idea that the study of the political organization and institutions of America might profit those interested in the future of democracy in France, this idea, which is the subject of today's talk, I think, appeared before the publication of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Volume 1 was published in 1835, so this idea that America can serve as a political model for France appeared earlier. The American Revolution, in particular, had served as an inspiration for French revolutionaries and lovers of liberty throughout the world, and France was no exception to the rule. And here is a quote from Marquis de Condorcet. It's the second quote on the handout. Condorcet praised the Americans. I will not read the entire quote, but he makes the point that the Americans have shown the world the right to secure the liberties for protecting individual rights. It is necessary, he says, that a country gives the example, and America, he writes, has given us this example. Its Declaration of Independence is a simple exposition of these rights, so sacred and so long forgotten. Among no nation have they been so well known or preserved in such perfect integrity. So there is a clear connection here between America's progress here and its political culture as enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. From 1815 to 1830, Condorcet wrote this, I think, in the early 1790s, but I'm not sure exactly the date, but let's put it at the beginning of the French Revolution. From 1815, so a couple of decades later, to 1830, French public opinion looked favorably at America and was relatively optimistic with regard to the stability and the future of its political institutions. So there was an optimism in the air. And I would like to give some examples that are not well known but deserve to be better known because they show that the French have always had a complex love affair with America. Here is the Secretary of General Lafayette, Charles Arnold Scheffer, whose dates are 1796, 1853. He was the editor of an important publication in the 1820s, and it is in this publication that he wrote that the American Federation showed the entire world the true popular government and liberty. The suggestion made by Scheffer was that the successful Republican political experiment in America paved the way for similar, or would pave the way for similar political developments in Europe. So America represented the future of Europe in political terms. The same theme appeared in another journal called La Revue Américaine, which was published for 1 year in France in 1826, 1827, and its editor was Armand Carrel. And Armand Carrel described the American Constitution as a model constitution, adding that this was not due to the fact that the Americans possessed an instinctive political genius, but because it gave expression to a stock of ideas that was common to all mankind. The American Constitution, he wrote, is not foreign to us, the French. It is the daughter of 18th century French political doctrines, fortunately combined with the most reasonable and tested elements of English institutions. So America provided a happy synthesis between the philosophy of the Enlightenment and the common sense and traditionalism in underpinning the English unwritten constitution. There were other admirers of America, lesser known today. One of them was a woman, a French woman, Madame de Staël. And this is what Madame de Staël confessed to Thomas Jefferson in 1816. Madame de Staël was the daughter of Louis XVI finance minister and then prime minister at the beginning of the revolution, Jacques Necker. This is what Madame de Staël wrote in 1816 to Jefferson. If you succeeded in doing away with slavery in the South, there would be at least one government in the world as perfect as human reason can conceive it. As perfect as human reason can conceive it. Shortly before her death, she told another American friend of hers, George Bancroft, who paid her a visit in Paris, "You are the vanguard of the human race, you are the future of the world." And this was more than a decade before Tocqueville. Madame de Staël praised the Americans, this is quote number 3 on the handout, in very flattering terms. And this is what she wrote somewhere at the end of her magnum opus, which was a book on the French Revolution, Considerations on the French Revolution. She wrote, "There is a people who will one day be very great, I mean the Americans. What is there more honorable for mankind than this new world which has established itself without the prejudices of the old? This new world where religion is in its fervor, in all its fervor, without needing the support of the state to maintain it, where the law commands by the respect it inspires, without being enforced by any military power." 1816, written by Madame de Staël. There were others who actually emphasized much the same points made by Madame de Staël. In particular, note in this quote number 3 here, the emphasis on the rule of law as the key to explaining the political development of America, but also look at the emphasis on the happy marriage between religion and liberty. It's a topic that Europeans have picked up on and have insisted that represented a pillar of the strength of democracy in America. Americans can be both committed to religion and liberty at the same time. This was not the case in Europe at that moment. And as I said, there are other small accounts of the virtues of American democracy by people who actually did not come to America, but had heard about it. One of them was a Swiss-born theologian and philosopher, Alexandre Vinet, who wrote, this is the 4th quote on the handout, "This state seems to have solved the problem which consists in reconciling the highest degree of individual liberty and the supreme conditions of security and order." On the one hand, individual liberty protected, on the other hand, security and order. There were others, such as Dupont de Nemours, who did come to America, who wrote that America was very advanced in terms of education. Concerning education, he wrote, "The United States are more advanced than most other political societies." Other French writers picked up on these themes and built upon them. In America, they wrote, "Power was limited, no one was above the law, and everyone obeyed the laws that were clearly formulated to serve the common good, not a narrow segment of the population, an aristocratic elite. The American government, it was argued, think of the difference between then and now, imposed low taxes and treated its citizens with respect. As the hand of the providence," one author wrote in La Revue Encyclopédique in August 1819, "As the hand of the providence, it governs without being felt and almost without being perceived," the hand of the state. Other virtues of the American system highlighted by the French during this period included the abolition of hereditary power, the presence of exceptional political leaders in America, and the existence of civic virtue linked to a healthy family life and solid work ethic. Almost as importantly, in all of these accounts, I'm talking about the period 1850-1830, French commentators emphasized the connection between liberty and religion and pointed to the important role played by the religious toleration in America and the freedom of the press in securing individual liberties. Also note here the relation between freedom, reason, and virtue, themes that would reappear in Tocqueville's works a decade and a half later. Liberty, reason, and virtue go hand in hand. However, doubts about the proper functioning of American institutions began to appear gradually in France at the very time, and as the United States was entering a new stage of its political development with the coming of age of a new generation of politicians who imposed the new political styles. Remember that Jefferson and Adams died. When did they die? 26? I think so, no? 1826. So we are talking about a crucial period in the history of America, and then suddenly a president like Andrew Jackson would enter the White House a few years later. And he imposed a new style, but he epitomized actually a new generation of leaders that came into power that was certainly different from the previous generation of giants that encompassed anyone from John Adams, Washington, to Jefferson and Madison. And this change took a high toll on the image of America in Europe. The old positive image came to be replaced gradually by the picture of a country with an uncertain future, facing a complex set of problems and challenges, and therefore unlikely or very difficult to argue that it should serve as a political model for Europe. So you might want to ask, what was the source for this French disquiet? The question is particularly important in light of our attempt to reevaluate Tocqueville's later criticism of American democracy against the background of previous analysis and critics of America. So there are a number of concerns that I would like to bring to your considerations today. One is there were doubts regarding the maintenance of the unity of the country at that time. But there were also doubts that went as far as to call into question the existence of a genuine national character in America. There was also a doubt arising from the expanding territory of the Union. So all these critics wondered if the American Republic would be able to survive over time, and some of them surmised that it might be even replaced by either monarchy or a form of military dictatorship. So there were concerns about that in the French press. But more importantly, some of the French began questioning around this time, we're talking about late 1820s, early 1830s, began questioning not only the possibility of importing American institutions to France, is France a political model, but they also came to question two of the principles that had been previously considered as pillars of American democracy. And one was bicameralism, the existence of two chambers in America was seen as fundamental, and then the other one was federalism. And they came to be regarded with increasing skepticism of the French. Some of them denounced American individualism, another pillar of democracy in America, as a narrow form of, quote, narrow rationalism, or Protestant egoism that fueled the materialization of human destiny. And there was another theme that appeared during this time, that was in America as a young and immature democratic society. The government, and this is quote number 5 on the handout, this comes from the pen of a distinguished historian and French politician, François Guizot, who turned out to be a kind of a mentor to Alexis de Tocqueville. The government of the United States, Guizot claimed in a famous discourse in 1834, is a good and beautiful government for the United States in the circumstances in which this society found itself at the moment of its birth, but it is a society that has just been born. He called it une société enfant, a child society. Note here, it's not a total dismissal of American democracy, but there's a lot of skepticism as to whether it will survive and whether it can be exported abroad. Progressive Republicans on the left also expressed their discontent with a number of aspects of American democracy, and they came to make a fundamental distinction between, on the one hand, the moral and the cultural aspects of American democracy, which they rejected, and on the other hand, the political aspects of American democracy, which they accepted. And this is a quote, number 6 on the handout, that I think there is a quote here that speaks to this topic. It comes from two journalists who published in La Revue Républicaine in 1834 a text from which I selected the following fragment. From the moral point of view, they wrote, "We do not belong to the American school." So they took distance from the influence of America. From the practical point of view, we belong to the American school in the sense that we invoke the example of America as a practical proof that demonstrates the application of the Republican doctrine of universal suffrage and its consequences. So note here the division between America is seen as a moral model, which they rejected, and America is seen as a political model, which they accepted. And the early 1830s, this time, saw the emergence in the French press of a new topic that seemed very intriguing to them, slavery. America, in quote 7 here, is the land of the free who cannot do without slaves. America is the cradle of equality, and no country in Europe contains so much servitude. Notice here the contrast between the rhetoric of liberty and the existence of slavery. This comes from a wonderful book written by Gustave de Beaumont, who actually was the companion of Tocqueville in America in 1835. Tocqueville wrote this novel. It's a novel of ideas called Marie, or Slavery in the United States, which I take the liberty of recommending to those of you who might be interested in the topic. It's a beautiful book. The idea that slavery tended to undermine the status and the future of American democracy gained wide currency in France within the next few years. In an article published in La Revue Britannique in 1831, his director, Saulnier, denounced the hypocrisy of American democracy, which he wrote, again in his quote 7, combined this liberty without any limits on one side and this abject servitude on the other. It's an unstable democracy because it's unbalanced, liberty and slavery at the same time. A poet, Alphonse de Lamartine, was struck by the contrast between this Congress, where one can constantly hear nice words, independence, human dignity, imprescriptible rights, and the inviolability of natural rights, and the miserable condition of the black population who cried out against so much philanthropic hypocrisy, quote unquote. If some critics pointed out that equality remained a mere ideal in a country with extreme form of racial inequality, others began to see the dangers of extreme forms of equality as well. So not only were the French were concerned about too much inequality, but some came to doubt the benefits of equality as well. And I'll give you one example here. It's a philosopher by the name Théodore Jouffroy, who feared the general leveling of conditions in America, a kind of dumbing down of 19th century would lead to a form of what he called mediocre civilization. Other French visitors of the United States at the time remarked the uncivilized, mercantile, and the materialistic character of American society. In their eyes, sophisticated French traveling to America in less than desirable conditions, the French the Americans led a life that was monotonous, and it lacked poetry. No charm, nothing. America claimed one of them who never came to America. That's interesting. They wrote about America based on other accounts, but there was this rhetoric of America there. This is Abbé de Lamennais, a very important theologian at the time, is struck by the plague of commerce. The outcome is a spirit of calculation that stifles or weakens all generous sentiments. And there's someone else that this time I did select for the handout. It's number 8. This is a conservative, Benjamin Saint-Victor, who wrote in 1833. He did come to America. The main question here, and it is alpha and omega of life, is to gain money, and then to use this money to gain ever more. The entire world does not seem to suffice to their cupidity, greed. And he deplored the restless competition and frantic commercial life again in America that created, quote, this perpetual and boundless movement of all cupid passions, the end point of all the worried thoughts of this multitude of people who constantly turn to earth, exhaust themselves under the sun in order to build a treasure or to increase without measure the one that they have already amassed. So you get the picture here. The Americans work themselves to death. The overworked Americans is a theme that appeared a long time ago in the French press in the 1830s. A similar line of argument can be found in the works of someone who also never came to America, And this was a major writer, Stendhal. Stendhal wrote a beautiful book, which I also recommend to those of you who are interested in the topic. It's called On Love. It was originally written in 1821. And in this book, he actually has a very unflattering portrait of America. Again, Tocqueville never came to America, but was obsessed with America. And this combination of never visiting or never experiencing first, live America and writing about it is not uncommon. All their attention, this is quotation number 9 on my handout, all their attention seems to be concentrated on a sensible arrangement of the business of living and on foreseeing all mishaps. But these efforts, he concluded, came at a high price. When at last they reach the point of harvesting the fruit of so much care and orderly planning, they find no life left with which to enjoy. Yet, unlike other critics, Stendhal did not see American morals as rude. That was something good on his part, at least. On the contrary, he was rather taken aback by their excessive politeness and rationality, which he found problematic, however, and unsatisfying. He acknowledged that America had a free government, that was a plus, which does its citizens no harm, but rather gives them security and tranquility, but this was not enough to achieve happiness. True happiness requires more than security and liberty, protection of rights. There was political happiness and then what he called true happiness, and the two did not always coincide in America. Happiness meant much more than being free from the interference of a bad, harmful, and incompetent government. The spirit of American government, Stendhal concluded, is a coarse spirit that gives the people the illusion of being happy simply because they enjoy security and tranquility. But there is something missing in America that the French surmised. And they insisted on that ad nauseam. Another critique of America was advanced by a friend of Stendhal, who, unlike Stendhal, came to America in 1827, 5 years before Tocqueville. His name was Victor Jacques Mons. He came from the circle of the French ideologues, and he was related somewhat to General Lafayette. So he was educated in a group that was pro-American, a group with whom Jefferson was also closely connected, and he came to America with an open mind. He was enthusiastic about learning English and refrained from passing superficial judgments about the country. Yet towards the end of his journey, he also came to be dissatisfied with the American way of life, not politics, but way of life. He wrote in 1827, "I dislike the American mores. Their aspects, sometimes severe and then not entirely lacking in nobility, is most often, however, cold, flat, and vulgar." Jacques Mons referred to the great American leaders of the past as Republicans by principle, but aristocrats in their mores, and he liked that. And he concluded that for all its virtues, the American way of life, the American dream, we would say today, did not provide for a civilized type of liberty. What is particularly interesting in Jacques Mons' case is that his conclusion that individual happiness was more or less independent from politics, from forms of government, coexisted with a sincere appreciation of many political aspects of American democracy. In this regard, he echoed the fundamental distinction made by previous writers between the moral aspects of American democracy, which they rejected, and its political institutions and principles. I selected one rather long quote, number 10, from this letter from 1827 written by Jacques Mons, because they give you a sense of what the French disliked in America. And here's an excerpt. "The intellectual habits, the tastes of any kind of a doctor are the same as those of a courtier. Take people from all the so-called liberal professions, bring them together in a salon for an evening, and listen to the general conversation which is established among them, sometimes among them. I would challenge you to find among them the smallest excitement for your mind. It seems to me that the Americans lack the humor of the English, and certainly they completely lack the graciousness of spirit, which is not rare among us, in such a way that they have nothing with which to hide their excessive ignorance. They lack both the content and the form. The conversation never rises above a subject of local interest, or if someone who considers himself capable wants to rise even higher and on a general tone, he only manages to provoke a deluge of the most banal and pretentious truisms. What we call society, nothing of this kind exists in America. There is nowhere else more spirit of association and less spirit of society." You can see even someone who was educated in a pro-American circles after an encounter with America in 1827 comes to write these harsh words about the American way of life, while at the same time he continued to believe in the principles of American democracy. But the conclusion is pretty harsh. What we call society, living together, does not exist in America. But he anticipated Tocqueville's analysis of the democratic mind, and he also raised some less controversial points about Americans that I think one would find in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He emphasized the uniformity in America, the fact that because of equality, people display the same habits, the same turns of phrase, and they encouraged children to pursue a certain type of education, and they all believed in indefinite progress. This is a theme that would appear in Tocqueville. Americans are optimistic, and you probably heard this idea voiced by foreigners. Americans are overly optimistic. Why? Because they believe in indefinite progress. There are very few pessimists in America. Very few, well, they said. And as a result, I think this was traced back to equality, and they saw that equality actually produces a certain frame of mind, a certain tone in society that they were somewhat ambivalent about, but they accepted as a major thing. It's also interesting to look at what they thought of Americans' self-interest. This is a topic that would reappear in Tocqueville's works later. Tocqueville praised, as I will mention in a few seconds, Americans for their self-interest, rightly understood. Americans know how to link their self-interest to the interests of the communities, and the French actually had observed this earlier, and they understood that the self-interest, rightly understood, is a pillar of democracy. They also understood how Americans applied the doctrines of self-interest to religion. And this was an important topic that would reappear in Tocqueville's work a few years later. Other French, and this is perhaps lesser known, chose to settle in America. Not only they came to America and went back to France, but some of them settled. Crèvecoeur was an example from an earlier period. But I would like to give an example of someone who is not well known today, but wrote a major book that should be discovered. And his name is Achille Murat. Murat wrote a book called A Moral and Political Sketch of the United States of North America, which was published in 1833. Murat actually came and settled in Florida and wrote the book after a few years. He noted that America of the late 1820s was still an agriculture rather than a trading country. And he also noticed that it was a land marked by great divisions between the slave and the free states. He settled in Florida and supported eventually the emancipation of slaves. He also regarded, not without bewilderment, the proliferation of Protestant sects. Being a Catholic Frenchman, he was surprised to see the religious awakening taking place a bit later, but still it was in the making. And he praised also the gracious society of the South. The spirit of conversation existed in the South. It did not exist in the North, he said. But he was taken aback by the territories west of Mississippi, which he thought were characterized by a rude instinct of robust liberty. A rude instinct of robust liberty, quote number 11 on the handout, which often degenerated into license, simplicity of morals, uncouth manners, and cynical independence. That's the outcome of this spirit. Coarseness and cynical independence. This principle from which so much good has emanated and which is destined to govern the world is what is called in America self-government, government by the people themselves. Note the ambiguities around this term, self-government. Yes, he acknowledges it promotes liberty, but it's not polished, it's not civilized, especially west of the Mississippi. Murat also commented on the attitudes of the Americans towards government. And he thought that competition for power was the secret of the American system. And unlike Tocqueville, for example, he had high words of praise for the Supreme Court and the judicial review system. And he criticized the electoral college system, which in his view thwarted the will of the majority. So we have in this book actually a fairly rich and robust account of the political life, but also the cultural life in America. And asked to clarify his own position on America, Murat concluded on a Tocquevillian note, Ivana lettre. He wrote, and this is quote 11 here. I think I have a mismatch here. But this is what he said. You will immediately ask me if I think of the Constitution of the United States the best possible and if I think it applicable to France. This question has been asked of me 1,000 of times. I do not answer it, at least at the present, for it is not that which is of immediate concern. It is not so much the Constitution and the laws of the United States that I admire and love, as the reason why the United States have this Constitution and these laws. This principle from which so much good has emanated and which is destined to govern the world is what is called in America self-government, government by the people themselves. So there is an ambiguity here in the second part of quote number 11. On the one hand, he criticized self-government. On the other hand, he sees it as the foundation of democracy in America. So what we saw so far from all of these accounts of French travelers and writers about America, we've seen a number of criticism and a number of praises here. What the French seem to have liked is the fact the authority of all previous standards was challenged: experience, age, birth, genius, talent, virtue. Equality was seen as a major development in America with mixed feelings. There were concerns about the possible tyranny of the majority there and also the excesses of liberty. And what I want to suggest is that this mixed bag with which they returned to France was also to be found in the writings of some English visitors to America. And I'd like to introduce them briefly just because they provide some spice to our discussion. It is hardly surprising that the English echoed some of the criticism of the Americans. They had a war with the Americans first, but they kind of shared with the French some aristocratic, let's say, skepticism towards American life. One such example, I'll give two examples only because time is precious here. One is Francis Trollope, who came to America, settled in 1827 in Cincinnati, had a disastrous business affair there that led to bankruptcy. And she published a major book called Domestic Manners of the Americans, which was a bestseller in England and the United States in March 1832. Trollope was appalled by what she saw as a total and universal want of manners in America, Americans as uncouth, unmannered. She deplored the total absence of the usual courtesies at the table, the voracious rapidity with which the meats were seized and devoured, number 12. The strange uncouth phrases and pronunciation, the loathsome spitting, from the contamination of which it was absolutely impossible to protect our dresses. People were spitting tobacco at the time. They were chewing and spitting. The frightful manner of feeding with knives, till the whole blade seems to enter into the mouth, and the still more frightful manner of cleaning the teeth afterwards with a pocket knife. At the same time, America was thought to embody precisely an orientation towards a cosmopolitan and universalistic philosophy, while Europe seemed defined by a more traditionalist and inescapable particularistic history. And I think we see this tension between these two images of America, tradition and innovation, in an account provided by a 20th century visitor, English visitor to America, the Catholic writer K Chesterton. Chesterton came to America in 1904, I guess, and he was particularly fascinated by what he called the creedal aspect of the American regime. And he concluded that the universalistic creed of the Declaration of Independence made America a nation with the soul of a church. And it's an essay he published in 1822, which was aptly entitled What I Saw in America, a nation with the soul of a church. He explored the apparent tension at the heart of America's universalistic creed and its strong sense of nationhood. Yet America's creed, he noted, can be accepted by anyone. It's a creed, but it's universalistic. It can be accepted by anyone regardless of tradition, race, or background. Quotation number 13 is from Chesterton here. the creed is set forth with dogmatic and even theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. It enunciates that all men are equal in their claim to justice, that government exists to give them justice, and that their authority is for that reason just. So what struck Chesterton, especially about the American Creed, was its universalism. The chief mark of the Declaration of Independence is its universalism. It's a theory of equality applied universally. So Chesterton contended that America could not be understood simply as a nation formed out of the cloth of the Enlightenment philosophy, as some have claimed. So America as the child of the Enlightenment. That was one of the interpretations. While there could be no denying that America's founding philosophy was grounded in the rationalism of the Enlightenment, Chesterton detected nevertheless a mixed lineage here, and in particular an old substratum that underlies the apparently new philosophy of modernity. And he wrote, this is quotation number 14, the last one, "The real quality of America is much more subtle and complex than this. It's mixed not only of good and bad, of rational and mystical, but also of old and new. This is what makes the task of tracing the true proportion of American life so interesting and so impossible." For Chesterton, America was like a palimpsest, a new world founded on the tenets of liberal self-interest and the rights of man, which overlay but could not entirely obscure the self-sacrificing devotion to public things, the Republic. So in conclusion, I think, all of these accounts of America before Tocqueville underscore that there was a rhetorical contest over America that started a long time ago and continues to this age. It also shows, to my view, that we still know too little, and they knew too little about America. This is a remark made by the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga at the beginning of the 20th century. And what Huizinga claims, we know much too little about America, and we imagine a lot about America, I still think it's valid today. This is especially true among many of America's critics around the world, who, as we've seen recently, but not only recently, have relied on myth and preconceptions of American society that are vicarious expressions of their dissatisfaction with their own societies. And there is an intellectual tendency, very prominent still today, to project hopes and fears onto America as a metaphor. And this makes it difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle the real America from the imagined America. In one sense, this is hardly an issue distinctive to America because, as we all know, we all imagine other countries, but some countries are more important than others. So very few people would care whether Luxembourg, what is the essence of Luxembourg and what is imagined about Luxembourg, or Liechtenstein for that matter. But it's different if you think about what the essence of Russia, and how we imagine Russia, and what's the essence of America, and how we imagine America to be. So there's a symbolical contest here, and not all symbols are equally important. For us Romanians in this room and elsewhere, it's important what is the essence of Romanians. But for you, probably it is not that important, and it's for good reasons. So it's, I think America has become a particularly potent symbol in the 19th century and also in the 20th century, and these misunderstandings carry particular significant consequences. So what we've seen thus far reveals is that there's a surprising, consistent, substantive continuity of perceptions and misperceptions of America that reveals sometimes more about the Europeans' hopes and fears and anxieties rather than about their understanding of America. So in another way, the European thinkers' battle over America was sometimes a proxy war over European civilization. They were concerned about liberty, equality, about the disappearance of nobility and so forth, about the Enlightenment, about liberalism and modernity itself. And there is a sense on the part of many European critics, some of whom we've examined here, some of whom we've not, 19th century in particular, that the values of the United States were destined to become those of the rest of the world, and they were concerned about that. America seen as not the past, but the future. Critics of America have always lamented, among other things, the mechanization of society, the fact in the ways in which American civilization alienates human beings from their deeper essence. They deplored the monotony of life that is brought forth by the American way of life. And they've also criticized America for the economic free market philosophy that has brought cataclysmic changes allegedly in other parts of the world. Now, it is of course tempting to say that little has changed to this day. Tocqueville presented a much more even-handed account of America that looked both at its virtues and limitations, and we can talk more in the question and answers time. But I think that when we look at current accounts of America today, we see some commonplaces that we can almost take out of 19th century criticisms of America. The McDonaldization of the world is a topic that we've seen in some of these critics. They didn't use the word McDonald, or the Euro-Disneyization of the world, Euro-Disney on a world scale. The Hollywoodization of the world, Hollywood blockbusters. We don't see this in the 19th century, but we have a sense in which Americans go for cheap entertainment rather than reading Descartes at home and engaging seriously with Plato and Aristotle. We also have critics of the fundamentalist right among European commentators, right? Europeans are always struck by the mixture of religion and liberty in America, and the phenomenon of mega churches has been completely obscured to many of them, I should say, including to myself sometimes. We've seen critics of politicians in America. We've seen numerous critics of an illiterate President Bush, voiced by the French media and others, and they've been taken to extreme. And these are only some of the examples of the horror of America routinely referred to and commented upon even today, which had some roots in the 19th century. To this, one can add now the iniquities of the economic neoliberalism in some circles, of course, and then the abuse of military power, which was seen always as a major affront to the French sense of greatness. But it's interesting also that while formally arguing that the United States and Russia are the same, Jean-Paul Sartre in the 1950s needed a shorthand label for the phenomena which he described as a catastrophe. And you know how he called the catastrophe of the modern world? He didn't use the word Russianization. He called it the Americanization of the world. That was the cataclysmic event that he deplored in some of his political writings. Be that as it may, the idea of America remains today one of the most powerful in the world still. Things might change in the future, but for the time being, examination of views of America reveal an interesting pattern in world politics, and underneath this pattern, a deeper struggle has always been taking place. And I think from Montaigne until the end of the Enlightenment, every major philosopher agreed with John Locke's famous statement that in the beginning all the world was America. America is the mankind's past. In the beginning, all the world was America. Up until the end of the 17th century, America represented Europe's past. After that, for about 2.5 centuries, America represented Europe's future. And I will leave it to you to decide whether that is still the case or not in what many now call our post-American world. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll open it up for question and answer. Please raise your hand and wait for the mic. That'll help us with the recording that we'll put up online. So, questions? If nobody's going to jump up, I'll go ahead and ask a question. It's interesting in the United States currently, Europe is somewhat of a political football, at least especially in the American right. We hear about Republicans decrying the fact that they claim that Obama wants to move us toward European-style socialism, is the quote we often hear. And I'm wondering, historically, when these writers were writing critiques of America, were there also Americans critiquing Europe? Has that same pattern followed? And are some of these sentiments reactions to criticism by the other side, perhaps?
That's a very good question, and I will disappoint you because I don't know the answer to this, but I'll try to speculate from the very little I know about this, and feel free to intervene on this. There were a number of American intellectuals who idealized Europe and kind of were all too eager to espouse and embrace the European lifestyle. Think of T.S. Eliot, for example. T.S. Eliot ended up speaking with an English accent that was more sharper than the English one, actually. And he ended up idealizing a certain way of life in Europe that he identified with. I think Henry Adams could be in that category, and Adams also might have been guilty of the same exaggeration. But I don't know what to say beyond this. It seems to me that at least among my students at Indiana University, I've a number of students who dream of settling in Europe and going to Europe, not only visiting, which is fine, it's more than fine, but also settling there. There's a kind of grass is greener.
Well, I
syndrome.
imagine those students aren't going to vote for Newt Gingrich or Rick Santorum, though. So it seems like it's kind of a wedge issue in America, wouldn't you say? How Europe is viewed.
I think so, yeah. And I know that we were talking today earlier that speaking French is a disqualifying asset in the current presidential elections. You cannot acknowledge that you speak French. That would disqualify you from any political office, period.
In connection with what Adam noted, we see this interesting reversal on the question of who represents the future. The question now is whether Europe is, in a sense, more advanced or further into the future in a decadent sense than America.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a sense, more along a road towards the socialization of society. And so the question arises, whether that is good or can be good, or whether it's bad and is to be avoided. It seems to be the consensus on the right side of the political spectrum. But it's as if there's a kind of reversal, and actually it is I find it an intrinsically interesting question. If you were to ask which society is, it's a very broad category, that's what makes the question interesting. Which society is more modern, North American or European? You could answer either way. I mean, there are senses in which you could make the case on one hand or on the other.
But there is a sense in which, especially after the crisis of the last 2.5 years with Greece and the other countries as well, Ireland, Portugal, and the list goes on, there is a sense in which Europe has emerged from this crisis as an exhausted continent, and I speak with sadness and nostalgia. I remain an European at heart. I draw my scholarship, my inspiration from European sources. I exude Europeanness. But on the other hand, I feel that the continent, at least to date, has exhausted its creative capabilities. The European Union project is struggling, and it's unclear whether it will survive in its present form or it's in a different one. I would have said that what's missing from the picture that all these authors, of course, are presenting, and it should be on our radar screen, is the rise of China and other parts of the world that would kind of, make a bid for whom should we imagine and care about first, and Europe probably would be on the back of that list, and Asian, the rise of Asia, South Asia in particular, is to be taken into account.
And Asia certainly enters the debate as far as who will own the future, in a sense, as well.
Yeah, and so I have a sense in which these debates of Europeans looking at America are charming through their in virtue of their let's say. Past, kind of a closed chapter in some respects. In other respects, no. As I pointed out, in some respects, they still are very much present here.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in the UK for 2 years doing graduate school, and one thing that surprised me when I moved there is really the intense preoccupation with the United States. I mean, I don't know if that's completely a two-way street, even. I mean, I felt like they were confronted with the idea of America through television and movies and technology, Microsoft, Apple, and had very developed opinions on it, whereas I don't think Americans would have nearly as developed, even sophisticated. And even if Americans are confronted with like the idea of Europeanness, like with Downton Abbey or something like that, it tends to be a I don't know where Downton Abbey comes from, but it's nothing like contemporary England at all. In fact, extremely the opposite. And I mean, what am I trying? What are the questions like? I wonder if that is, whereas like in the time you wrote about, America was constantly confronted with Europeanness because that's where they were drawing their political thought and things like that. And then it was kind of a sidelight to French thought. Whereas now it seems like the roles have reversed, where Europe is really constantly confronted with Americanness and not so much here.
It's an experience that is shared by other. Some of my students have remarked precisely the same thing, that they knew. I think they went to Spain. My students' favorite destination is Spain. It's easy to surmise why, and they are shocked to see that even the Spaniards know more about America than they know about Spain. I'm not surprised, but that is a fact. It seems to me that that's a normal phenomenon, and I would, if I were to advise someone where to go, if I were giving advice, I would recommend go and study non-European cultures and settings in a good sense. Study Europe, but don't limit yourself to Europe. You have to go beyond that. So I have the feeling that we are past that age. I'm fascinated by the rise of I don't think China will replace the United States as a major power, but we need to come to terms with that, understand and what it means and how to deal with that. And that's an important thing. India is another fascinating example, but I'm also fascinated with Brazil, for example. All of the encounters I've had so point in that direction. So I'm interested in opening the debate towards those. I think the rise of Brazil has been underplayed here.
Any further questions? Then I think with that, we'll close the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention.